So we're in the book of Revelation, the apocalypse. That comes from the Greek word apocalypsis.
It's time to change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Revelation. So grab your Bible. We'll be starting in chapter 17.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
And so now in chapter 17, we will get an explanation of who this religious Babylon is and how heaven described it and how it has fallen. And there's always been a Babylonian false church all through history, all since Nimrod and Babel. There's always been a church that has had this mother-child worship and using all the same kind of garments and the same types of symbols and beliefs. They just use other names. You find them in all the cultures. You find them in Rome, with Venus and Cupid and all these different names. And it's always been opposed to the true God, and it's always killed his saints. And some of the worst things that have ever been done to true Christians have been done by the false church. And I don't know if any of you have read this, but if you've ever read the Fox's Book of Martyrs, you'll read about 288 Christians that were burned at the stake under Queen Mary, who ruled over England. And this one actually did happen under the rule of the Roman Catholic Church. And all those people, they died in just a short 3-year period, because that was from 1555 to 1558. And nowadays, when we look at our world, we see these kind of murders happening more frequently to Christians throughout our world. You'll see them a lot happening, and you hear of a lot of it happening now in Africa, because the false church has always been the enemy of the true church of Jesus Christ. And I would say that this also includes liberal Protestant churches who, instead of trying to conform their lives to Jesus Christ, they try to conform the church into the image of the world and to conform to their values. All right. So now, after we've been told about these 7 mountains, we're told also about these 7 kings. And then here it says, 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And so those 5 kings that have fallen, well, those are 5 kingdoms that have already passed through the different periods of history. And so those would be the kingdoms of Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and Greece, because all those world empires have already passed by John's day. And the 6th one, which is the one is, well, that would be Rome, which is the current one that's going on during John's day. And then it says that the other has not yet come. And this is talking about the Antichrist, and with him being over the 7th kingdom. And this is still while the Antichrist is still ruling with the other 10 horns, the 10 kings that come out of Europe. And it says that this is only for a short time, because we know that it lasts for less than the 7 years of tribulation. And then it talks about this last king. And now it's actually calling him the beast. And it uses the same title, the beast that was and is not. And it tells us that he is the 8th king and that he also was the 7th. And then again, it tells us he's the one that's going to perdition. So he's the one that's going to hell. And to understand these verses in 10 and 11, you kind of have to look and you have to understand that verse in verse 12. Because in verse 12, it tells us that these 10 horns, these 10 kings of Europe, they have only been given authority for 1 hour. And it says they're all of one mind to give their authority to the Antichrist. All right, so now this is how this all looks to me. That the Antichrist, during his early days and in the very beginning of the 7 years of tribulation, he carries this united universal false church system called the harlot. And through that system, he makes all these allies with all the nations of the world, and with all these 10 kings, with his kingdom of peace. So that's when the Antichrist is the seventh king. And that he rules over these 10 kings, which are the 10 United Nations of Europe, that revived Roman Empire. But somewhere in the middle of the Antichrist's reign, and it's probably when he is mortally wounded and healed, he becomes a different man. And now he is popular with all the people. And when he's healed from that mortal wound, and now he becomes what is called that blasphemous man. And he establishes himself as God. And this false church that he's been carrying, the harlot, he has no need for her anymore. And all these 10 kings, that they're in agreement with him. And so they give the Antichrist all of their authority, all the authority of the whole world. And then together, they destroy the false church, the harlot. Because this is when I believe the Antichrist image is put into the temple. And so now there's no more middleman. There's no one taking away any of the glory from the worship of Satan. And they will only worship Satan through the Antichrist directly. Because in the end, the Antichrist, he will not tolerate any worship than the worship of himself. And there's something else you need to see here, that this judgment of the false church is not just from the mind of these 10 kings. Because it says there in verse 17, it says, "For God has put it in their hearts to fulfill his purpose, for them to be of one mind and to give their kingdom to the beast." So all of this here is being done under God's direction. And so now under the beast, the whole world will get what it's always desired. It'll get this godless religion under a godless ruler, and that's what the world has been demanding for forever. And so that's this week. This is chapter 17, where we've seen the fall of religious Babylon. Next week, we're going to go through chapter 18, and then we're going to see the fall of commercial Babylon. And this week, we're going to look at chapter 18, which is considered to be the fall of commercial Babylon, or economic Babylon. But there are some really good scholars who don't see this as being two Babylons, but that it's only one Babylon being judged here. And even if that's true, there are two aspects to this one Babylon. And if we're reading the original writings of the book of Revelation, we wouldn't see any chapter breaks. And we would see that this whole book is really just one long narrative. And there are a lot of similarities between these two chapters, where both Babylons are under the rule of the Antichrist, and both of these chapters talk about a queen who's being judged. So both of these chapters are intertwined together. But the way that this looks is that in chapter 17, the religious Babylon is being judged at the midpoint of the 7-year tribulation period. And when we get to chapter 18, at the judgment of commercial Babylon, this is happening at the end of the 7-year tribulation period. Now, Babylon here, we've read, has clearly been called a city. And it's been called a city 8 times in the book of Revelation. And some people believe that the ancient city of Babylon will actually be rebuilt, and that the book of Revelation is actually talking about the city of historical Babylon. And Saddam Hussein, when he ruled Iraq, he had a desire to rebuild Babylon and to restore it to its ancient glory. But in the Old Testament, in the books of Isaiah and in the book of Jeremiah, we're told repeatedly that the city of Babylon will not be rebuilt ever. And so most scholars equate this Babylon with the city of Rome. And you can see when you read in the Apostle Peter's first letter, he used the name Babylon as a code name for the city of Rome. And John's original readers, they would have also been thinking of Rome when they read these words about Babylon the very first time, when they read the Revelation. So realistically, commercial Babylon here is most likely symbolic, just like religious Babylon was symbolic. And that this name is being used for a godless combination of government, religion, and commerce that has been developed by Satan and carried out through the beast. And so this fall of Babylon is the fall of a spiritual Babylon, of a world system, and not the historical city of Babylon. And so this next part, this reminds me again of that movie, A Christmas Carol, also known as Scrooge, where one of the angels, done with George Bailey, and then another angel takes over. And you can imagine this old man, John, standing there, seeing one thing after another, and where it's taken us weeks just to get through these chapters and to go through all these things that John saw. And it makes you wonder, how long did all this take for John to see this whole vision? Did it happen in one day, or just part of a day? Or was he just standing around and looking up at the sky? Or was it all instantaneous? All this vision in just minutes, like being uploaded in the movie The Matrix? Because John goes from the present to the past to the future, and he sees everything from the heights of heaven to the lows of the bottomless pit. And he witnesses all of man's condition in the last days. And he even sees the future of all those who follow Jesus and the future of all those who refuse Jesus. And although when John was a young man, about the age of 17, he walked with Christ for about 3.5 years, but in reality, John, just in himself, he's really not a great man. He's just an old man, just a fisherman from a small city, not being far from his own death, because it's always Jesus who's the great one here. And so John, this prisoner of the emperor of Rome, after discussing things with angels all day long, he says these familiar words, meta tauto, after these things. And then he sees another angel coming out of heaven, all shiny with glory. And some want to say this is Jesus Christ. But the word for another here is again that word alon, meaning another of the same kind. And so this means this angel is another of the same kind as the angel we just saw in chapter 17. And this isn't your average angel. This one has great power, and it has radiant glory that all can see, which would really stand out and really be quite a contrast to the darkness all over the city of Babylon. And he has this loud voice, so everyone can hear him clearly. And he says, Babylon the Great is fallen, is fallen. And he's not repeating himself because he's stuttering like I do. But when this angel repeats, is fallen, he's emphasizing how great this fall is. And he's also suggesting that there is a double judgment here. And just like heaven is the gathering place of everything spiritually good and godly, where in heaven we see the gathering of the church and the tribulation saints, the elders, the angels, along with the 4 living creatures, Babylon in earth has become the gathering place of everything spiritually foul, every wicked demon and every filthy spirit. When he says a cage for every unclean bird and hated bird, it's using the term bird in the same way that Jesus used it in the parables when he talked about Satan stealing the word from someone's heart in this parable of the sower and the seed. And then we're told how all the kingdoms and all its leaders have all been made rich by the relations with the commercial Babylon. And again, it calls it fornication and drunkenness. So all this is done by moral compromises and unethical practices. So there's a cost. So you have to be a little nasty to be able to attain all this wealth and success. So everyone here is in bed with everyone, and everybody's getting rich. And all the merchants of the earth are all becoming wealthy. Every business is successful because of its relationship with Babylon. So under the Antichrist, there's going to be a great economic boom where all the markets have gone wild. And I believe it'll be the strongest economy the world has ever seen. And so the way I think this would look is that the whole world will just be as profitable as the United States, if not more, when it's at its very best. And so everyone is intoxicated with all these luxuries and pleasures, and no one will be denied anything that their flesh desires. And then there's this other loud voice. And this doesn't come from that great angel, But this voice comes from heaven itself. And this most probably is God's voice, because the voice says, "Come out of her, my people." And so if it's God's voice, or even if it's not, it's God's message. And so it makes you wonder, what's God's people doing there? What are they doing in Babylon? And the truth is, we're just as attracted to the things of the world as they are. The things like success and riches, just like they are. And many Christians have been enticed and carried away into these type of compromises, which are traps spiritually, because we always end up paying a price. They separate us from Jesus. And I'm not talking about being wealthy. Having money isn't a sin. But when you compromise and everything is about getting ahead and having to have more, being driven, being covetous, because money makes a good servant, but it makes a terrible master, we should look at our money as if it's God's. And that's if we have much or if we have little, because we belong to Him. And it really doesn't mean that much, but He means everything. And He could always give you money, but He wouldn't want to if it would separate you from Him. And so God calls His people out of Babylon, because we're all made from the same flesh. And this is why the Apostle John has warned us in Scripture in his letter in 1 John in chapter 2, verse 15, "Do not love the world or the things of the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but it's of the world, and the world is passing away." And this is not the only time God has called His people to come out of Babylon. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but after all the people from Judah, the Jews, were carried away into exile into Babylon, and you can read it in 2 Kings and in Jeremiah, and that after the 70 years of being disciplined in Babylon, God called His people back to Jerusalem and into the land of Israel. But it was only a very small remnant that returned to Israel. And that's because the Jews were very prosperous in Babylon, and it was easier to stay there. They had too much success. And in a worldly sense, it had so much more to offer them than the struggles of what it would be like to resettle a country that has been utterly destroyed. And you can imagine, many of them would have thought to themselves, well, we'll go back in a few years when we have more, because it wouldn't make sense to leave Babylon now, not while things are good. We'll go back later. We'll go back rich. But they didn't go back, and they lost their identity as Jews and as being the people of God, which is a much greater loss, losing all the spiritual riches and being a part of God's plan of good for the world. And so I imagine here, when God calls for His people to come out of her, many don't or won't come, because Babylon has made many of them wealthy. And so any of God's people who are still in Babylon at this time, who are still part of this world system of spiritual Babylon, they need to remove themselves, or else they're going to share in their sin and be judged with them and receive the same plagues they receive, which doesn't sound much different than when Lot's wife was judged with the city of Sodom because of her heart that it was still in Sodom when she turned back. And I don't know about you, but I believe God has told me to leave places, or else I would be judged with the people I'm sitting with. And I'm not talking about being at a worldly concert or a bar or some kind of adult party, but I believe I've heard Him speak to my spirit while sitting in a church that was out of order. And at that time, I'd even taken a friend with me to this church, trying to share the gospel with them. And I had been to this church a few times before, maybe once or twice, because they had a night service and I was working during the days. And this church wasn't really my cup of tea, but it was a church, and it was open Sunday nights, and I knew I needed to go to church. But the last time that I was there, things got really crazy, and they were saying things about God that just weren't true. And they were working up the crowd to get them to make these strange commitments of faith and to act out in the service, all in the name of the Holy Spirit. It was one of these prosperity type gospel churches who claimed promises that God never spoke. And I believe God told me to leave, and he told me to leave now, or else I would be sitting with them in their sin. So I got up and left and took my friend with me. And then I had to explain to this non-believer who I was trying to share the gospel with why I had to leave. But the part of this that seemed the strangest to me is that God was telling me to leave this compromised church while the rest of the congregation, they just stood there and they swayed back and forth, waving their hands, all excited. They were running around without any convictions at all. And I just want to tell you, it can be hard to be a Christian who follows Jesus, where we can't be a part of the crowd and just follow them. When God reveals to you that they're off, we must follow the living Christ and not a church. And you need to get used to that, because times are going to become more like this. And we need to learn to wholly obey him and obey the leading of the Holy Spirit, even when nobody else does, to follow him to the best of your understanding. And so I kind of hope y'all don't get up here at once and leave me here all alone. So Rebecca, could you just please sit back down? But I would never assume that I was the only Christian there. I'm sure there were others, and I'm not even saying that they were in sin for staying there, but I believe I would have been in sin if I stayed, because he told me to leave to the best of my knowledge. And I don't know, but I think sometimes these are tests we have to go through to see if we will really stand for him, even if it's only us, because days are coming, and they're already here, where it will become even more difficult to stand and to prove to those around us that we're really his. And here, God is not giving his people a long time to delay, because just down in a few verses, it says that her plagues are going to be coming, and not only in one day, but in 1 hour. But here in verse 5, where it says her sins have reached the heavens, and where God has remembered her iniquities, this is probably a reference referring to the Tower of Babel, where the people attempted to make a tower that reached into the heavens. And then in verse 6, it says, render to her just as she rendered to you, and repay her double according to her works. And the Greek word for render here is apodidomai, which means to pay a debt and to repay it double. It's what the law required when any money was made deceitfully or by thievery. And so now Babylon, for her sins, she's going to have to repay double. And Babylon's sins, they're named here. And the first one is pride, where she glorified herself, living in luxury while others suffered. And she says about herself that she sits as a queen, and she says she's no widow. And we saw that verse last week. And the way she's dressed in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and gems and pearls, and she's dressed like she's a queen. But she was never a queen. She only dressed like one. And for her to be a widow, she would have had to have been married. But she was never married. She was a whore. She was a fornicator. There has never been anything legitimate about her. And you have to remember, we're talking spiritually. But there have been no spiritual cleanliness or spiritual purity ever in Babylon.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, you can still make it to church today. And join us at 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,